Well, thanks, Steve. As Steve said, I'm Mark Bach, Lake Country Power's General Manager. A couple things for me before we really get rolling. First, I want to introduce and thank all the employees that are here helping with this. I got Derek Howe, our Chief Operating Officer down here. You'll hear from him. Tracy Wertinen, our Chief Financial Officer. You'll hear from her too. Over here at registration, Tracy Alto, Consumer Account Rep out of our Mountain Iron office. Amy Schroeder's over there too, Member Service Rep out of Mountain Iron. Monique Sandquist at that table as well, a Manager of Member Service out of Mountain Iron. Scott Twining, a Member Service Technician. If you've had issues with a hot water heater or heating system, it may have been Scott that you've dealt with. Scott's one of the field workers that takes care of that kind of stuff. Ben Wilson in the back, our Finance Manager. Greg Schultzenberg in the back with the goatee. He's the Manager of Community Relations and Marketing, so he's in charge of our Communications Department, a really integral part of putting this stuff on. The guy at the camera is Jerry Burns, also in our Communications Department. This meeting is getting filmed. We're videotaping this so we can post it on our website and our social media channels for folks who can't make it to one of these district meetings. So those of you joining us at a later date, good evening. And then Becky Seeley, our HR Director, is right in the middle of the room. So thank you to all of the employees who helped put this on. I'm going to give you a round of applause. Like Steve said, if you could, please hold your questions to the end. We've got a lot of info we're going to cover. We might address your questions. So I want to bring Derek Howe up now, our Chief Operating Officer, and we'll get rolling right into the content.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives we have to help reliability. And of course, when you look at reliability, one of the biggest things we can do is rebuild some of our old infrastructure. So we have 6,300 miles of overhead line on the system. We do 75 miles of that every year, so that we're doing a piece of that appropriately over the life cycle of that asset. And just a reminder, we did hire 10 linemen within the last 2 years that do 45 of that internally to try to save some costs. So if we start, I'll just start kind of at the dots on the slides. These are the projects in your area. So at 11 o'clock, that yellow dot is a project we're doing on the south side of Sturgeon Lake. It's on Memory Lane. It's about a mile of overhead that we're going to convert to underground because there's been a number of outages in that area, so that should help with the outages. Moving up to 12 o'clock, that blue dot that's just above the area, that's actually a job on Meadowbrook off of Highway 73. We're doing about 4 miles of single-phase age. So the guys are out there cutting trees right now. We're doing the right-of-way clearing on that job. Moving down to the next blue dot, they're kind of at 1 o'clock. That one is Sand Lake Circuit 3, and that project's already been done. So when I talked about our internal line crews that are doing these projects, they already did this job earlier this year, but it was about 1.6 miles of aged infrastructure we had along the Reed Road. And continue on, over there at about 2 o'clock is Pike River Circuit 3. So that's along Highway 21. If you want to see our guys in action, they are starting to work on that job right now. It's 4.6 miles of single-phase single-phase line that needs to be replaced. The blue dot kind of in the center there is in Iron. It's along Old Highway 169, and it's about 2 miles of old single-phase line we're going to replace. Half a mile of that will convert to underground. But there will be some tree cutting that needs to take place along that project. And finally, the job there probably at like 8 o'clock, the yellow dot over there in Shoal Lake is, that's over in the Balsam area. We've got, along Highway 56, we've got about 2.5 miles of three-phase underground that we need to replace. One of the other things that we do that's very important for reliability that probably has the biggest impact on reliability is cutting the trees. We break the system up into sevenths, so these are all the substations. Each one of these colors is a substation on the Lake Country Power system. And we break it up into sevenths and we rotate through, so every 7 years we get through the entire system. Right now we're on the 3rd year of our 2nd time going around. We were just here in this area last year, so it'll be another 6 years before we're back here. But you can see we're kind of in the Ely area, on the northeastern edge, Ely all the way down to Cotton. Another opportunity we have is, of course, you've probably heard about some of the Inflation Reduction Act grant money that's been out there. We are trying to take advantage of some of that because it'll help us to defer some of the costs that we would incur for work that we were going to do anyway. So we took a look at projects that we have in the system, and we had about 17 miles of jobs that we put in for that grant money for, that hopefully will get funded through those federal dollars so that we don't have to pay for that infrastructure improvements. They're judged based on a number of criteria, so we look for projects that are in an economically challenged area, that have a high number of outages, that improve the system reliability, so that we tried to pick 4 projects that we thought would have a good chance at getting selected. We also participated with a number of other cooperatives in North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and South Dakota on a mutual grant program for another $4.2 million worth of projects. So with that, we're installing what we call bellwether meters throughout the entire system. Those will basically be meters at the end of each feeder, so that we'll know like the voltage conditions, so that we can better manage the system, and we can actually operate the system in a manner to save money. We also looked at some feeder ties and some 3-phase expansions that we were going to do that we can hopefully get funded through grant dollars. As Steve mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about supply chain issues, and Tracy will elaborate on this, our Chief Financial Officer, but I just wanted to cover some of the costs that we've seen in materials, because they're pretty astounding. So when you look at the last 3 years, just from 2020 to 2021, we had a 35% increase in the cost of our substation materials. If you look at 2 years later, from 2020 to 2023 till now, we've seen a 66% increase in the cost of all of our materials. That's on average. So that's just a phenomenal increase. And even more importantly, on the lead times, we used to have to plan most of our projects on a 6 to 8 weeks to get some of the key equipment that we use. We're having to plan any of the material we get now is pretty much over 50-week lead time. So we're actually staking jobs and planning jobs 2 years ahead. We're already looking at 2024 work just to try to stay ahead of the supply chain issues that we're seeing. But some real-world examples that we see on this is substation transformers. So those are, of course, what we have at the head of each substation. We have 45 of them. In 2019, those cost about $350. The one that we're going to replace for cotton this year is going to cost us about $700,000. So that's about a double. That's a double, 200% increase. Substation regulators, we just got an update yesterday. We thought they were going to be 78,000. They're actually 91,000. So they went from 35,000 in 2021 to 91,000 today, and they have a 2-year lead time. PVC we saw, that we use for our conduit, that we put all of our conduit in to protect it. That's seen a 500% increase. Underground cable went from $4 a foot to $12 a foot. And poles, something as simple as poles that we use, of course, throughout the system, typically those had a 1-week lead time. We actually had a period last fall where they went up to 16 weeks for us. Luckily, we have arrangements with our vendors and our manufacturers where we have consignment arrangements, and so we have slots. Otherwise, some of these things like substation transformers, we have a slot every year because we rebuild a sub every year for age. If we didn't do that and we just needed to order on the open market, it'd be a 3-year wait time to get that substation transformer. Same thing with poles. Because we have a consignment arrangement with our vendor, we didn't see the lead time increase to 55 weeks like others did. We only saw 16, but still, that's pretty astounding when you think that you have to wait 4 months to get a pole, something as simple as a pole. And it's not just the material. When we look at the labor, we're seeing huge increases in labor as well, which is why we hired those 10 linemen internally to try to hedge off some of that. We saw that coming and we tried to get ahead of it. But when we bid out the construction work for this year, there was a 35% increase in the cost of that labor from last year to this year. So typically we do about $3 million worth of contractor work every year. So that equates to about $1 million in extra expense every year. Right away has been even worse because they're having a lot of trouble finding people that want to get out there and do that manual labor and run a chainsaw. We've seen labor increases anywhere from 40 to 100% on our various contractors. So we're doing about $5.5 million worth of right-of-way work every year, and that equates to roughly $2.5 million there as well. So even conservatively, if you look over the next 5 years, we'd be looking at least $15 million in additional labor costs if we had to go out on the open market. Now, the reason that we don't have to do that is because you're probably aware we sold our subsidiaries last year. Part of the negotiation when we sold them is we entered into a 5-year agreement, and under the contract that we arranged with them for the labor prices is pre-COVID pricing. So we got pricing that is underneath all of these increases. So that was a huge part of the benefit of selling the subsidiaries was not only the money that was gained in doing so, but also entering into this 5-year lower cost labor agreement that's saving us about $15 million. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Peterson, our Chief Financial Officer. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. I'm the short one in the bunch, so. I just would like to say welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight. I am Tracy Peterson-Wharton, the Chief Financial Officer at Lake Country Power. Are we there yet? These 4 words I'm sure we've all heard coming from the back seat of a car on a long road trip. And I think this is an appropriate theme for our district meetings this year. It seems to me anyways, we've been in a constant state of change since the beginning of 2020 when COVID hit. And just when I feel like normal is within reach or right around the corner, something seems to happen and we just don't quite seem to get there. Tonight, my conversation will mainly focus on our rate philosophy and some of the challenges we continue to face at Lake Country Power and how those shaped our 2023 rate considerations. I'll also talk a bit about the financial impact of the storms we saw in 2022 in our service territory, as well as a couple of new program offerings we're excited to roll out at Lake Country Power. Looking at our long-term rate philosophy, it's grounded in a cost-based rate structure. To help us achieve that goal, we undertake a cost of service study every 3 to 4 years. The last one was completed at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and we are currently in the process of completing an updated cost of service study. The study aims to align our revenue recovery where we incur our costs. It considers a multitude of data. It looks at our fixed costs, our variable costs, and it also works to align our rates so that one member or class of members does not subsidize another. For example, we don't want our residential members paying a rate that would subsidize our commercial members, and the reverse would be true as well. So moving into 2023, we were again facing some notable challenges. Derek has already touched on some of this. We've all experienced challenges in the changing marketplace over the past few years, and we at Lake Country Power certainly has not been immune. Last year around this time, as Derek mentioned, we were looking at about an average of 30% increase in our line material since the pandemic began. And at the beginning of 2023, that number rose to an over 60% increase on those same materials. And also lead times, as Derek mentioned. In some regards, it seems they may be getting better. We have received a few trucks that we ordered probably over a year ago, but we are still seeing some historically long lead times for much of the materials and equipment that we need to do our jobs. And again, are we there yet? This slide, I have just a couple of examples of how prices have increased since the end of 2019 on some of the common materials you see out in our system. The first one is a single-phase power pole, which would be representative of the 2 pictures in this slide. Materials at the end of 2019 to construct that pole would have cost us just over $1,800. At the end of 2022, same materials, same pole, $3,115. That's a 72% increase for those materials. That's not including labor to construct that power pole. That's the pole, but not the labor. So the materials, yes, it includes the pole. Also, another thing that you commonly see in our system is a 25 kVA pad mount transformer. When we purchased those at the end of 2019, they were just under $1,500. At the end of 2022, $2,972 for that same transformer. That's a 100% increase in 3 years. And really the big question is, will what has gone up ever come back down? Something that we weren't anticipating a year ago when we were talking to you all was purchase power, wholesale power supply rates. Last year at this time, we were actually anticipating a slight decrease for 2023. And as it turns out, that didn't come to fruition, and we're actually seeing an increase in our purchase power rates from Great River Energy. There are a number of factors that go into wholesale power costs: natural gas prices, capacity prices, transmission costs, recent and pending legislation, which Mark will talk about in a minute, These all have an impact on wholesale power costs. Our rates from Great River Energy will impact both our general service and our load management program energy rates. And overall, it equates to about a 7% blended rate increase to Lake Country Power from Great River Energy in 2023. And as wholesale power costs make up over 50% of our annual expense budget, this increase does have an impact. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about interest rates. They are another factor for us. We do borrow a percentage of our construction work plan every year, so some of the work that Derek was talking about earlier. As you all are aware, we've enjoyed historically low interest rates for many, many years. And as rates increase, we will incur greater interest expense on our new borrowing. We do need to generate enough margin on an annual basis to ensure that we're meeting our loan covenants, and interest expense plays a key role in meeting those covenants. So ultimately, these increases in interest rates can have an impact on what we need to do with our rate structure. So as a result of these factors and many more, we were again faced with some difficult decisions moving into 2023. This slide is just a brief outline of the 2023 rate changes. Load management rates on our demand side management programs saw an increase on January 1st. These impacted only members who partake in those rates, and they are a direct pass-through from Great River Energy. So the rate increase we saw from Great River Energy for those respective programs was passed directly along to the members. The general service energy rate increased on March 1st. I don't believe any of you have seen bills for those yet, but they will be coming out March 1st, so this is a per kilowatt hour rate change. It addresses purchase power and other variable cost increases that we've seen and discussed here this evening. Coincidentally or not, these rate changes align with the 2019 cost of service study, which is already several years old. So I think we've done the best we can to keep those rates as flat as we can for our membership over the years. And lastly, the service availability charge will also increase effective on March 1st. And this addresses the significant increases, many of which we've talked about here tonight, in our fixed costs that are related to our electric distribution system. The cost of infrastructure and all that's entailed in that exists regardless of how many kilowatt hours a member uses. We have to get that infrastructure out to our members. And it really doesn't matter if you use 10 kilowatts or 10,000 kilowatts, it still costs us the same. And I would just like to add that I feel the board and staff have really done a great job of managing and maintaining the rates over the years. Mark Bach, prior to my being in this position, was the CFO, and he really jumped through hoops and pulled every trigger he could to make sure that we kept our rates as stable as possible. And again, as you all know, there's only so much that can be absorbed. This is just a snapshot of our single-phase service rates. This change impacts virtually all of our residential members and the majority of our commercial members as well. This rate change is necessary for reliability, service to our membership, and compliance with loan covenants. You can see on here, if you can read it, I'm not sure if you can see it in the back, but the service availability charge changed from $42 to $48 on March 1st, and then there will be a 0.56 cent increase on the kilowatt hour rate. And while it seems a little bit contrary to talk about affordability when talking about rate increases, we are doing what we can to minimize the impact to our membership. There really is no greater focus in our decision-making processes than all of you sitting in this room, and we have 40,000 some odd members. That is always front of mind for us. If you haven't seen the rate changes, they were printed in the January and February newsline. They're also on our members only section of our website. We do have some copies of the newsline if you want to grab one on the way out, if you haven't already seen these. There we go. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about the storms that we experienced on our system in 2022. As I'm sure many of you in this room are aware, last year did bring a number of large storms to our service territory that had significant impact to many of our members. Not only was there impact to way of life, no electricity, staying warm, all of those things that come with a power outage, especially in the middle of December, there is definitely a cost associated with that for the cooperative. And I do think 2022 may have been a historical year for the large number of storms we saw in our service territory, and certainly in recent history. Listed on here, we had 2 significant storms in the month of May. We had one in June, and then that more significant one probably in the month of December. The top 2 were declared federal disasters by the federal government. The June and December storms were state declared disasters. So what that means is the cost for those top 2 storms, we expect that we will receive 100% return on the costs that we submitted to the federal government. The June and December storms were state declared disasters. We are optimistic in that we will see about 75% of those costs come back to the co-op. Looking at the total on these, you're looking at about $2.3 million in total costs. Last, I'm going to just introduce a couple of new programs at Lake Country Power. Hope Serve is a program that we are working toward rolling out later this year. It is a partnership between Lake Country Power and Home Serve, which is a member of the Touchstone Energy community. And basically what Home Serve is, it's a totally voluntary value-added program for our membership. There's no cost to the co-op, and there's no cost to a member if you're not interested. It fills the gap between what we can offer as a service to our members and what members may want for additional services, appliances, different systems within your home. Home Serve administers and manages this program. It's pretty hands-off for Lake Country Power. They currently partner with 29 different utilities in Minnesota, and they have about 19,000 customers in the state. So we're looking forward to getting this program up and running. And this is probably hard to see in the back, but this is a list of the programs that we will be offering to our members. Some on the list are cooling systems, interior electric, exterior electric, appliances, and so forth. Each has a different monthly cost component. You can choose one, you can choose all, you can choose none. And again, we're looking forward to rolling out this program. We're hoping to have some more information available at our annual meeting in April. And if you feel this is something you'd be interested in, just keep your eyes open. There will be more coming. And finally, the Education Improvement Program was approved by our board in June of last year. There is a carve-out in Minnesota statutes that allows cooperatives to distribute abandoned, unclaimed capital credit funds to tax-exempt organizations. It's a unique carve-out for cooperatives. Other utilities, other businesses do not have this option in the state of Minnesota. We have historically used these funds to provide scholarships for students within our service territory, and we will continue to do so. But as the dollars have grown over the years, we felt we could do something more, and the board has chosen to give back to independent school districts in our service territory. That last bullet on here, I just want to focus on, these cannot be used for LCP operations. We cannot take this money and use it to pay our power bill. We can't take this money and use it to pay salaries or build a substation. It is very specific in the statute what the dollars can be used for. And as I said earlier, most businesses within the state do not have this option. And I think there is consensus among cooperatives that if you leave these dollars sit and they continue to grow and grow and grow, eventually the state may decide that they have better use for that money and will eliminate this carve out in the statutes, and we won't have this opportunity. So we're taking advantage as best we can to give back to school districts in our service territory. This is a list of the 11 schools that the board approved grants for at its meeting in February. We did receive applications from 22 schools. The board approved grants for 11 schools. So a pretty nice list all throughout the service territory. And again, it's nice to have the option to try to do something good for the schools and the members in our service territory. With that, and that was enough, I will turn it over to Mark Bach, our general manager. Thanks.
You can take this topic if you want. Okay, so I get the privilege of talking through some legislative issues and updates with you. There's one piece of legislation that passed in Minnesota earlier this year that's going to have a big impact on us. It's the 100% carbon-free by 2040 bill that passed the House and Senate, was signed by the governor in February. So what is it? Energy sold in the state of Minnesota under this new law has to be 80% carbon-free by 2030. Cooperatives, when this got introduced, we were down in St. Paul right away trying to explain the difference between us and other forms of utility. So one of the modifications we were able to get is that it's 60% by 2030 for co-ops and municipalities, but still 90% by 2035, and by 2040 it has to be 100% carbon-free energy in the state of Minnesota. There's also included in that is an increase to the state's renewable energy standard. If you remember back in 2007, there was legislation that created the 25% renewable by 2025. This modifies that has to be 55% renewable by 2035. So two separate pieces. Renewable and carbon-free aren't necessarily the same. So it's 55% renewable by 2035, but 90% carbon-free by the same 2035. The big difference in those equates to nuclear. Nuclear is carbon-free but is not renewable, so they're two separate things. Currently, Minnesota is roughly 30% renewable. So we're ahead of what would have been the 25% by 2025 renewable energy standard. So I'll talk about some concerns we have with this. There's reliability concerns I'll get into, some affordability concerns. Local control, and what I mean by that is decision-making authority. And then just the timeline of how this all happened. I'll touch on this. In January 20th, I'll back up a little bit. If you look at the makeup of the legislature, there's over 60 new faces that took office at the beginning of January. So there's a lot of educating that still needs to be done of brand new legislators. And any good legislator will tell you when they take office, they don't know anything. And they figure that out over time, that when I got here, I didn't really know anything. So there's 60-some people in between the House and the Senate we have some educating to do. With this legislation, we didn't get time to do that. January 20th, it passed the Energy Committee in the House. January 25th, it passed the Energy Committee in the Senate. Passed the full House on January 26th. Passed the full Senate February 3rd. And Governor Walz signed it into law by February 7th. So from the start of the session in early January, that is incredibly fast for legislation of this magnitude. It didn't leave much time for public input. That was intentional. This is roughly the same language that was attempted to get passed in years prior that they weren't able to get done. So it was fast-tracked. If you read your February newsletter, I had a cover story on that where I was asking members, listen, please contact your legislators. There are concerns with this. By the time you read it, it was already too late. It was already signed into law. So there was very little we could do. We were down in St. Paul with our statewide association, the Minnesota Rural Electric Association, and Great River Energy, myself and other Minnesota co-ops doing what we could do to seek modifications to protect some of these concerns. But I'll get into those now. From a reliability perspective, this puts significantly increased reliance on variable sources of power. What I mean by that, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. So now we're going to put our eggs in a basket that may or may not be producing at any given time. To fully do this, you're going to go 100% by 2040. That technology doesn't exist yet. It's being developed. There's a lot of battery technology that's being developed. There are other forms of generation that are carbon-free that are being developed. But as of today, being able to do this, that technology does not exist. So from our standpoint, we run utilities, right? So what we do is critical. I wouldn't say, I mean, what happened here is hope. And hope isn't a plan. We operate in an industry that's more important than that. I don't want to hinge our future on the hope that these things will get developed, but that's what just happened. MISO, if you've heard of that, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, that's the regional grid that we're a part of and a participant in. It goes from Manitoba all the way down to Louisiana. And NERC is a federal agency charged with overseeing reliability. As recently as just this past December, it was the 22nd and 23rd of December, MISO and NERC were issuing warnings for potential energy shortfalls. MISO called for what they have a max generation event over those 2 days. And what that is they called on every utility in that footprint to run every one of their generating resources to avoid the risk of any potential blackouts. That's already where we are. That was in December. And then MISO studies have shown that once the renewable penetration exceeds about 40%, it can create some exponentially unreliable issues in the regional grid. So put it to what real world examples, what we're talking about. That graph on the right, at any given time you can go on MISO's website, they've even got a mobile app, and take a look at what's feeding the load. It's updated I think every 5 minutes. So I pulled this up, it was February 3rd, it says 7:15, but that's Eastern time, so it's 6:15 our time. February 3rd was one of those mornings where it was 35 below up here. So I thought, well, I'm curious, because this legislation was about to be signed by the governor in 4 days from that. The Senate had just passed it. Well, what's feeding the load? 39% coal at that time, 38% natural gas, 12% nuclear, 7% wind, 4% other. Most of that other is hydro. There is some garbage burning in there and some biomass, but mostly hydro. And solar at 0. It was dark. Solar is doing nothing at the time to serve this load. So what's the big concern? Get that clicker to work. Those two right there, coal and natural gas. That was carrying almost 80% of the load in MISO at that time. That all has to be replaced by 2040. 90% of it replaced by 2035. That's only 12 years from now. So there's a few changes to the legislation we were seeking in the limited time we did have. One was trying to get an exemption for peaking plants. What those are small generating plants, mostly run on natural gas, but have the ability to be run on fuel oil or diesel fuel. They don't run more than probably 12 hours a year, but when they run, it's because they're necessary to keep the lights on. So we sought an exemption for that. We weren't able to get that passed. That didn't get included in the bill. Minnesota currently has a moratorium on any new nuclear generation in the state. We sought to at least, if you're going to do this, at the same time, let's lift the moratorium on any new nuclear. That's not saying we're going to build any, but it's not saying that we can't. So no one is going to investigate or study building any nuclear in the state of Minnesota if you can't. So it's prohibiting anybody looking at that. Well, we weren't able to get that in the legislation either. There's a lot of energy coming into Minnesota that's generated in other states, most of it North Dakota. There's a lot of coal generation in North Dakota that comes into Minnesota. We were looking for an exemption on it was generated out of state. Can we have it just so what's generated in Minnesota has to be carbon free? We weren't able to get that either. So the way it is any energy sold in Minnesota has to be carbon free. Doesn't matter where it's generated. So any of the coal-fired power from North Dakota is going to fall under this as unacceptable. And another thing, most do this mostly to try to protect some of the mining around here. We tried to get into that bill. If you're going to push more windmills, more solar panels, there's a lot of critical minerals that go into that. So we sought, well, if you're going to do this, can we get protections in there to ensure that any of the minerals that go into new solar, new wind, any new development in Minnesota, can we make protections so that was not generated by child or slave labor? They were not willing to put that in the bill either. So to me, it's me talking here, not the company, but this didn't create solutions. It created a lot of trade-offs. So use the word NIMBY at it. So we can't see it here, doesn't mean, it just means it didn't happen. So what's gonna happen is there's child enslaved labor in the Congo that's mining a lot of the cobalt that goes into this, other areas around the world. So you're shifting what would have been emissions from utilities in Minnesota to emissions in other places or environmental catastrophes in other places. Affordability, the concerns with that, in order to do this, require a massive build out of new wind turbines, new solar farms, and then along with that, the transmission lines that would be necessary to take that from where it's generated to the load. And it has to be, due to the unpredictability of weather, whether it's sun or wind, has to be geographically dispersed over an extremely wide area. You can't put up all those turbines in one area of, say, southwestern Minnesota, because it might not be windy in southwestern Minnesota. So you've got to have them spread all over in hopes of gathering some of that from somewhere. Then that just creates, and transmission lines are incredibly difficult to permit, route, build, incredibly expensive. They go through years of study. I think if you started now, I don't think you could get these permitted and built by 2035, 2040. And then existing facilities, base load power plants, there's been a lot of money put into those in environmental upgrades over the years, cleaning up some of the coal generation. That money hasn't been recouped yet. Those plants aren't at the end of their useful life. There's still some money that is getting collected as they sell energy into the markets. You're going to force early closure of that, but it's still going to have to get paid for by ratepayers. Can I get you at the end? Back to affordability, some of the stuff we talked about, Minnesotans are already feeling it. You're feeling it at the grocery store, you're feeling it at the gas pump, you're feeling it everywhere. You're feeling it from us through some of the supply chain stuff. And now this legislation is going to pile on that. So this economic forces are already driving up electric rates. Look at high natural gas prices was a big driver of Great River Energy's increase. Some geopolitical events are driving that. You look at the Russia-Ukraine situation, that has had an upward push on natural gas prices. And as we've gotten away from coal, we've gotten more reliant on natural gas for power generation. Well, natural gas has price volatility and always has. So in periods of high gas prices, we've been able to fall back on lower cost coal in an effort to keep electric rates pretty stable. But now we're not going to have any coal to fall back on. And then just simple economics. There are pushes to electrify major sectors of the economy. Look at transportation probably being the biggest one. A big push for EV deployments. And there's legislation in Minnesota, I don't think this is going to go anywhere, but legislation to ban the sale of gas-powered lawn and garden equipment by 2025. Lawnmowers, chainsaws, leaf blowers, that all falls in there. But there's a major push to electrify everything. So if you're going to do that, and at the same time you're going to put major hurdles on the supply side, you're going to make power harder to generate, not as easy to come by, while spiking demand for that same power. All that does, in simple economic equation of supply and demand, is increase price. Local control. Piece of this legislation is pretty concerning to us. Right now, your co-op is governed by locally elected, democratically controlled. So Steve Rocker is elected by the members of District 3. You don't like what Steve's doing, you can vote him out. I didn't mean that, but that's how it works in a co-op. You have a say. You have a direct say in the governance of the organization. So in this case, there are a couple of, they're calling them off-ramps, ways to get out of this. So if you can prove that there's a reliability problem by doing this or an affordability problem by doing this, you can go in front of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission and seek an off-ramp. What we wanted is those decisions to be made locally. But now what you're going to have is a 5-person commission in St. Paul who's been appointed by the governor, who's going to decide what's affordable, or who's going to decide what's acceptable for reliability. It takes that decision-making control out of the hands of your locally elected board. A few other comments. This isn't California, right? So if there's blackouts here, and it happens in the winter, there is no doubt there'll be property damage. Pipes will freeze, you'll have all kinds of problems. But if it happens here in the winter, people could die. There's a real public safety concern if we end up with rolling blackouts here in the winter. It's not a beach day. The battery technology to fully do it doesn't exist. They're working on it, another concern here, but that's going to have to be on a whole nother level than it is right now to make this work. And then nobody has reduced carbon emissions more than Minnesota's utilities, and that's nationwide, that comment. We were about 5% renewable in 2005, about 30% today. We were projected to be roughly 50% by 2035. We were already trending this way. We were about 65% coal generation in 2005, 26% roughly on coal generation today, and we're going to be down by about 5% by 2035. So Minnesota's utilities are already going this path, but we were doing it in measured steps to protect reliability and protect affordability. A complete elimination of any utility carbon emissions in Minnesota, which the last number I heard is about 0.07% of global emissions. So if Minnesota eliminated all of that today, there is no measurable impact, none. So the question is, how much are you going to ask Minnesotans to pay to accomplish something that is totally immeasurable as it relates to climate? And by saying that, I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't go this path. We've already been going this path. But let's not act like we're saving the world by doing this. So the legislation it's unnecessary and it's a bit extreme. So those are our concerns with that piece. Right. So another one, this one hasn't passed yet, but it's being discussed this week. It relates to paid family leave. So what is that? I'll tell you in a second if I can get this button to work. So what it does, it creates a whole new bureaucracy at the state of Minnesota to administer a paid leave program. What's in it? You could have 12 weeks of paid parental and family leave and 12 weeks of paid medical leave. So that equates to 44% of the working days in a year. Every employer in Minnesota has to participate in this. It's effective in 2025, implementation starting this year if this law passes. And how it's funded is through 0.7% payroll tax on every paycheck for every Minnesotan. The concerning piece to that, there is no cap on what that percent can become. So if this program gets off the ground and that 0.7% isn't even close to being able to sustain it and fund it, that percentage will go to whatever it needs to make this program viable. So in that, employers, like us, it says we can charge back up to half of it to our employees. Well, most of our employees are governed by a collective bargaining agreement. If the state of Minnesota thinks we can just give them a 3.5% pay cut and say the state did it, not us, well, they're fooling themselves, so we'll have to give it up somewhere else. What it's going to equate to is, right now, is a 0.7% of our payroll as additional expense that falls on the backs of our ratepayers. Our employees aren't asking for this. Our employees have paid leave. This accomplishes very little to the benefit of our employees. It just adds an extra cost that then we have to pass on to our ratepayers. Shift gears away from that, thank God. If you're around on April 20th and you can make it down to Cromwell, take the quick shot down Highway 73. Come join us at our annual meeting in Cromwell. I think, Greg, you've told me every single meeting what time it starts. I never retain that.
4 o'clock, you can come, and the meeting starts at 5:30.
Yeah, so we'll be down in Cromwell on April 20th, so that's coming up pretty fast. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions or comments you have, and then we can wrap it up with the door prizes.